am going to talk on some of the points that we've mentioned already. But I thought what I would do is start out with what our vision is for our organization, because it actually will identify where our trade space is. And so we really are about just helping realize a future where decisions and actions for the benefit of humankind are informed by coordinated, comprehensive, and sustained Earth observations. So you can see that we're really upstream from much of the work that all of you do in this audience. It's an enabling mechanism at best. If you think about that previous vision statement, then there are a couple specific objectives that fall out of that. Improve and coordinate observation systems globally, provide access to data and information, advance broad open data policies, and then build capacities. So each of these specific objectives you can tie back to maybe each of the words in that vision statement, but you ought to be able to look at this and see that it really is an advocacy and an enabling institution. And so in the bio where it talked about this system of systems, this is a schematic for it. Whether it's space-based observations, ground-based, or marine-based observations, we really want to bring data together so that it can be integrated across each of those platforms. It's platform agnostic for a number of, we happen to call them societal benefit areas, that range all the way from agriculture down to weather, because what we see globally is that for many of these either platforms on the left-hand side, or those societal benefit areas on the right-hand side of this graph, a lot of the data is in fact collected in silos and only delivered to those specific business areas, or verticals, I guess, as this community would call it. And yet, all of these are integrated in an Earth system, and so it's important for us to integrate that information across these domains and across those platforms. Membership is open to member states of the United Nations. We are not a United Nations organization. You'll see 98 member countries here. We've got some significant gaps in the world. If you look at South America, Africa, the Arab states, and really many Pacific Island nations, because at 98 member states, that's only half of the UN member state now, which I think is 193 or 194 countries. And so there are a lot of small island developing nations in the Pacific, which, when you think about it, are probably most likely and susceptible to be negatively impacted by climate change. But what separates us out, I think, from a lot of UN organizations is this category of membership called participating organizations. And I've circled a couple of them here. Secure World, because Laura's in the audience, OGC, Mark and George have been here, and then also ISPRS. Now, because largely ASPRS is in the audience. To be a participating organization, you have to be an international organization with an interest and or a mandate in Earth observations. And so it's quite a good network there, but you'll see a little bit later that it's still not broad enough. And why isn't broad enough is because we haven't in any meaningful way really brought the private sector in. Now, we think about the private sector with a graphic like this. There are in fact data providers in that upper tier, many of you in the room, value-added providers also in the room, and then the downstream verticals in agriculture and energy and water. Each of this is a broad ecosystem in and of itself, and yet when you really want to think about informing decisions, it's critical for them to be at the table. So we do in fact have a broad stakeholder community, whether it's those member states and participating organizations, whether it was the participating organizations that are UN agencies and treaties and conventions. You're going to hear a little bit in a minute from Greg on UNGGIM. Whether it's those international development banks, and they're not in the equation right now, but again, the World Bank has been here all week, and you can see that many of these institutions are making considerable investments out on the landscape. And so again, our interest is helping to inform those decisions with Earth observations. And then the international scientific associations and organizations which are in the organization. And then lastly, the commercial sector. And again, Nancy, your logo's here a little bit bigger because those two at the bottom, the European Association of Remote Sensing Companies and Nancy's organization of IGES, it was these two organizations that co-signed a letter back to GEO and our governing body in 2012 and said, great, you've got members at the table, but you really do need to broaden it to the private sector. And then of course our partnership with Geospatial Media. So just transitioning really quick in these next couple slides, here's a quote. Many of you may know Dylan Radigan, now co-founder of Helical Outpost, but he was MSNBC personality for quite a long time. Uncertainty is the enemy of investment, and shared information is the antidote to uncertainty. So a lot of our work is really about reducing that uncertainty, and probably, and so again, the hook for us is shared information. We've got some data sharing principles that talk about, for government data, the full and open exchange of data, products, data at minimum cost, minimum time delay, free of charge or cost of reproduction at the best. And again, if you were in the Earth observation session this morning, you saw nothing is free. What we're talking about are free to the users, and particularly if the taxpayers paid for that information, they ought to have access to it. And so lots of imagery and data sets on the left-hand side of this graph, largely government entities, emerging involvement with the private sector. You'll see Digital Globe, Blackbridge, and Esri there with interoperability agreements. We do have a website and a portal, and again, in the Earth observation session this morning, I think it was Shawana Johnson's presentation that said, you know, portals are so yesterday or last decade, and yet for us it still is a mechanism for people to discover and access information. And here's the slide that showed just the Landsat story, of which I did have some personal experience. First Landsat satellite, 1972. US sold the data for $400 or $500 a scene when the government operated the satellites, $4,000 or $5,000 a scene in the mid-80s when the private sector operated the satellites, and at the peak of data sales, 53 scenes a day. That was 2001. Managed to convince the Office of Management and Budget and OSTP that, you know, it's a government asset, people have paid for the data, we ought to just release it broadly. And then here's what happened to the data. You'll see that almost 25 million scenes are being downloaded globally. And yet it was Scott mentioned this in his talk, it was a substantial amount of money for the Geological Survey, $4.5 or $5 million from selling 53 scenes a day, but it wasn't a good investment for the federal government because it was largely other federal agencies buying that data, universities funded by the National Science Foundation, or contractors funded by the Defense Department. So it took a few years, but in 2011 some economic analysis was done, showed that annually about $1.7 billion back to the US, $400 million internationally, for a global total of $2.1 billion, which far exceeds the $4.5 or $5 million that one agency was collecting. So that's so it's good for federal agencies, and this is why we are advocating this, is to continue to sell your data. You are largely just creating a barrier for your sister organizations, for those other federal agencies. And yet, I would argue that economic benefit is largely gleaned from universities and innovations in universities or in the private sector coming in and adding value to this base data. So when we think about that uncertainty that Dylan Radigan talked about, there's probably no better example than agriculture. And I know over the last couple of days we've spent a lot of time talking about this. This just happens to be wheat prices, global wheat prices, monthly from 1960 to 2011. And you'll see that we had relatively stable conditions back in the 60s and 70s. starts kind of changing through the 80s and 90s, and then particularly when we get out into the 2000s, 2010s, then we've got swings on the order of 3 times. So if you want to create a more food secure world, then a graph like this has got to be stabilized. We've got to kind of return to the conditions of the 60s and 70s that you saw on this from pricing. Earth observations can in fact influence that. I guess what you see here is a number of our countries and a number of participating organizations have come together to implement some guidance that we got from the G20 agricultural ministers, which is, could you, GEO, and your GeoGlam program work with AMIS, the Agricultural Marketing Information System, to start bringing in Earth observations data into this equation. And so again, you're just looking at a snapshot on August 13th, I guess, 2012, drought conditions in the United States through Europe and the Russian Federation, and yet healthier vegetation compared to the 10-year average in Canada and parts of China. So the sooner that you can get this information into the equations, we would start, in fact, helping just play our role in creating a more food secure world. So since September 2013, we have in fact been working with 36 institutions, 22 countries, 7 international organizations to provide monthly global maps for the 4 major crops of maize or corn, wheat, soybean, and rice. And you can drill into it by grain, in this case rice, and or by particular country, Thailand, and see the actual conditions at that point in time. So our meeting, it's the end of the year, all those 98 member countries, those 87 participating organizations. We hope the private sector will meet in Mexico City. And then I guess I would just end by saying, if we have any hope of creating a more food secure world for this young farmer or for any of us, we've got to bring Earth observations and geospatial information to bear, and it's got to influence real policy level financial decisions. But the way to do that is through more broad open sharing of the vast amounts of data that are out there, and really opening up the door with an enabling environment so that the private sector can come in and add value to this base government data. And I'll stop there. Thanks.